Hello and welcome to our interview series on TIA, Technology Impact Assessment. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia and has been ongoing since November 2024. My name is Katina Michael and I'm part of the Social Cyber Institute, and today it gives me great pleasure to welcome John Payne. Hello, John, how are you?
Hi, Katina. Well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's great to be in the same time zone for a change.
Yes,
John is the chair of Electronic Frontiers Australia. It's the oldest digital rights organization of 31 years, actually, in Australia. And John's specialization is data privacy, but I wanted to ask him a bit more about his background. Like, John, how did you get involved in civil liberties and in digital rights? And tell us more about your background.
sure. It's got a sort of curious background because most of my working life has been corporate, but with a strong concentration in data privacy since 1990. Um, I've always been supportive of digital rights, particularly privacy, and even though I've worked in corporate organizations and private and public sector, I've often made submissions to government in my own right in respect of changes to the law that I thought were essential. So I've always thought that Australian privacy law was never fit for purpose. And whilst working for businesses, large organizations like National Australia Bank or Johnson and Johnson or Australia Post or Deloitte, which are some of the organizations I worked for, I've always tried to bring to the table different values around privacy and data ethics and tried to move things more towards society and customer friendly outcomes as opposed to doing the bare minimum that the law says you have to do to be compliant with privacy law. So I've tried to um, change culture internally by um, giving a different sort of voice that results in a more trustworthy organization in its relationship with customers and their data. And a few years ago, 3 years ago now, I joined EFA and the EFA board to actually focus on that as something that I'm really towards the end of my working career in a few years, I guess. And I really wanted to do something with the skills and knowledge I've acquired in data privacy and tech policy to do something for the common good. And the best way I thought I could do that was to join EFA.
It's fascinating, John, speaking to you on this basis. I teach a lot of MBA students, a lot of business students, and in the past, computing, social science students, and many of them have this backbone about rights-based work, but they have no idea how to get involved. But what kind of qualifications do you require to do something like what you're doing today and actually held all those corporate positions? What was that background?
My original background was commerce, banking and finance major, which I then completed and moved on to completing a dual degree, Bachelor of Laws and Jurisprudence. But it was predominantly my work that got me interested. I was working for National Australia Bank in the 80s, late 80s, and I got put onto a project which was the credit law reporting changes that happened in Australia in 1990. I got seconded from the bank to the Australian Bankers Association, which is their business lobby group, and I hate business lobby groups, to work on the project on the industry response to this proposed legislative reform package. So obviously, as a lobby group, you try and push back as hard as you can on the government, which I found to be very conflicting. So I found some of the attitudes and behaviours coming from the banks in general, at odds with my own personal values. So it was quite a challenging time, but I found it a fascinating piece of work, and I knew that with being a nerd and interested in science and computing and tech, this is going to have huge implications for society going forward. So I sort of hitched my wagon to privacy then, before it became a thing. So yeah, that's the short of it. Yeah,
Fascinating. We often talk about competing interests of individual stakeholders, and often we silo into people. This person's from corporate, this person's from government agencies, this person's from a NGO or a not-for-profit, a third sector organization. This person is representing consumers. But in actual fact, from my own experiences, I've found that we wear multiple hats, in fact, sometimes three or four, and we can't discount that we are citizens as well. Um,
yep,
how does that work as you're working at the precipice, at the intersection of where industry and consumer representation meet, or government and industry meet, and we talk about competing interests of the self? Uh,
yeah,
can you explore that with us a little bit more from your own
yeah.
experience?
Probably about 7 years ago now, I came to a point where I kind of reached the decision that it's time to get out of corporate, and I got into some consulting work, both individually and for a couple of organizations. And I found that much more um, rewarding in terms of the ability for me to influence outcomes and influence organizations in a positive way that resulted in good consumer or societal outcomes. But still not fully able to make the sort of change I wanted to. But with my knowledge and experience, it gives me a bit of a unique advantage moving into digital rights to mobilize a bit more effectively, because I've seen all the lobbying, I've heard all the stories, I've heard all the BS that organizations put into
Mhm.
avoiding the impacts of new laws that might restrict how they might collect, use, or manage personal data. I could speak freely to big tech companies and how they um, use the mythology of technological determinism and exceptionalism and sprinkle their pixie dust on, before our politicians' eyes to try and get them to adopt tech. We're currently seeing in Australia now with the discussion around AI adoption, for example.
Mm.
So it's quite liberating to be able to act more freely without the constraints and fiduciary obligations you have to an employer.
It's fascinating again. I mean, many of us belong to academic institutes, think tanks, advocacy groups, but you have to be mindful of all of these memberships if you have multiple kinds of memberships, because uh, not that your freedom is curbed, but you have to be mindful about who you're representing at what time. And so I see the liberation of now going into something like Electronic Frontiers Australia, um, where you are able to be free without those additional ties. And that brings me to the notion of power interest grids and how third sector organizations or not for profits or non government organizations or advocacy groups are viewed. Uh, those civil society groups in particular are viewed by third party organizations, government agencies. Is it this David versus Goliath kind of perspective, or are the tides changing with regards to participation from representative groups and stakeholders?
It's really hard to tell in terms of two things. Number one, how organizations are perceived by government in relation to their advocacy work. And also, some organizations engage in activism as well. And some of that activism can be, a bit militant or hairy chested,
Mm.
good for making a point and getting some attention, but it won't necessarily change minds. Similarly, some organizations or some people believe that you shouldn't get in the room with a regulator with whom you have opposed ideological beliefs. To me, that's not sensible. You need to actually
Yes.
get in the room with people who don't agree with you and have that exchange of ideas, that discussion and debate to try and move the needle. So that's some of the challenges that we face. I think in the past, the EFA has been more involved in activism, but with changing boards, and the board changes every year, and the
Yes.
composition changes every year. Um, Still working within a broad philosophical and ideological construct of digital rights, we perhaps look at different ways of mobilizing and educating on digital rights than other boards have had in past years. So we do use social media quite effectively to um, generate awareness of key issues that are facing Australia today in the technology space, tech policy space. But our membership base is small. It's only a very small volunteer-run organisation. So we do try to use social media effectively to reach a broader audience. And that seems to be working reasonably well because over the last couple of years, we're definitely getting much more interest from media. We're definitely getting much more interest and reach out from government than what we have in recent years. But as I said, the board goes up and down. It's cyclical in terms of having peaks and troughs of activity and activity. And I think this year we're on the ascent, which is good.
I think these groups are vital in society, actually.
Sometimes you do wonder whether you are being invited to consult on the basis of ticking a box, in the sense that the government is inviting you to comment on a particular bill, um, or whether they're genuinely interested in what we have to say. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Sometimes the government can behave quite badly when it's approached to consultations. A good example of that in Australia was at the end of the parliamentary season last year in 2024. The government rushed through its social media minimum age legislation bill.
Yes.
It essentially gave the public 36 hours, 48 hours in which to generate a response and lodge a submission. So to us, it was an egregious and grotesque breach of democratic process to use the parliament in that way to rush this really, really important legislation through. And it's going to have horrendous consequences.
Yes, we've seen similar happen with encryption law some years ago, right before Christmas.
2018, yeah,
And
yeah,
everyone was too busy wrapping up end of year
yep,
celebrations to be worried about that one. But, I do empathize with your sentiments regarding whether stakeholders invite third sector organizations to join the party, so to speak, simply to check a box that they've engaged or consulted, and yet none of that has actually occurred. I've seen this personally with big tech organizations that invite you to deliberate, but it ends up being a demo of their latest product range. And
yeah,
when you ask some thorny questions after you've left your telephone and other devices at the front desk, there's a blank look or actually a redirection of the
yeah,
discussion.
yeah,
So, this is the plight of volunteers, and many people in third sector organizations usually decide whether they will attend these sessions or actually they will turn down the invitation. And there can be sometimes mixed feelings within the same organization about the strategy to take, given the independence of volunteers and what they wish to do and how they wish to contribute. I think both are necessary. And one thing I wanted to ask you about the demands of volunteers, especially those that have competing interests with full-time work, parental guardianship, and other outreach. What does that look like in the average day of a volunteer? How do requests come through to them and how they filtered and how can they actually allocate time, which is usually unpaid?
yeah. For us, we have our board, and it's an operational board, so we're all volunteers. And we donate and give of our time and resource and expertise. So it tends to be based on a group-based decision model. So we might have a broad outline of what our activities might be for the coming year, but that can change quite rapidly depending upon what sort of curveballs the government throws or what happens in the tech space. Um, a good example is, we've been sort of watching the developments with the government trying to develop an AI safety framework, and that was led by one particular minister who lost his portfolio at the start of earlier this year, and the work that he had been done, that he had been doing in relation to setting up an Australian AI governance framework was pretty robust and thoughtful. But following a push from big tech and tech lobby groups, that's been sort of pushed to the wayside with the replacement minister, Tim Ayres, Minister for Industry Innovation. So we're, pretty concerned about that. So clearly one of our focuses going forward will be looking at by the regulation of AI, particularly through the lens of civil society. And at the moment, we are just getting barraged as citizens, by different actors, different platforms, different organizations pushing their AI products down our throats. And Microsoft currently is a good example of them being really naughty with their renewal of their current version of Microsoft Office by bundling in their AI agent, but telling people that the price has gone up by 50% because of the AI agent, but not telling them the fact that they could renew their old version of Office without AI at, the normal retail costs. Misleading representations. Luckily, our Australian Competition Consumer Commission has picked that up and will commence litigation against Microsoft, which we think is an excellent response.
We've seen many AI clients be embedded in even social media, inclusive of Snapchat, and you can't get rid of it in the freemium context, even though advertising is very much bundled in with social media. But it's fascinating to hear that perspective. If I bring our conversation now, given we've established a context for your work and your role within Electronic Frontiers Australia, uh, tell us how technology impact assessment relates to your work on the board.
Technology impact assessments are something that EFA would be supportive of, very supportive of, in the same way that we've had other types of assessments. We've had um, data protection impact assessments over in the EU. We've had privacy impact assessments in Australia slowly developing, currently mandated for public sector organisations, government agencies, but not currently part of law requiring private sector organisations to do these things. They're good. Similarly, TIAs, similar to algorithmic impact assessments, a very good tool, but that they are not as well known as they should be. They're not as well embedded in government as they should be. And it's really important from a tech policy perspective to ensure that these tools are adopted rigorously to prevent government, who are meant to have our best interests at heart through the social contract, um, falling prey to the sales pitch and representations of big tech with, tech utopia and tech determinism, all sort of mixing that in as well. So we think it's very, very important that TIAs be used as a means of assessing the impacts of new technology. That matches our philosophy. Is we're not opposed to tech. We want technology to be for our good and betterment. That's our core philosophy.
From where you're sitting, John, uh, who would conduct TIAs, and where do you envisage within government that sitting as a institutional framework, perhaps? Who does it, when, and where does it sit?
That's a really good question, and it goes to how we might want to regulate tech. And we regulate tech through a multifaceted means at the moment, through different types of laws, depending upon which part of the supply cycle you're looking at. Um, so it's a question: do you create a new regulator, or do you break it down into a series of component parts, and then place those component parts into the jurisdictions of existing regulators such as the OAIC, the E-Safety Commission, the ACCC, and so on. So there's arguments for that, and there's also arguments for creating a new um, regulator potentially.
Very insightful. If we delve now into the construct or the artifact that is known as TIA, or the process or philosophical approach, what is your basic understanding of what a TIA does?
Well, basically, it's a tool that should be used, which is based on scientific communication and interactive principles, looking at the use of technology and its impact on um, society, its impact on individuals, impact on government. And it's a tool that seeks to identify and mitigate bad outcomes or risks, particularly in regards to societal harms that might arise through the deployment of technology. Um, and it would be useful also in the sense that tech and big tech sort of live with the myth of technological exceptionalism, where they have the mantra that any regulation is bad because it slows down uptake.
Mhm.
It impacts on innovation, um, and otherwise is denying positive change to society. That we have problems with because again, it's this sort of entrenched belief in technological determinism that all tech is good tech, that it can't be bad and it's not neutral, which is false. Um, and that regulation is necessary for technology because it helps, not inhibits, um, innovation. It helps organizations innovate in a positive way, in a useful way, in a way that where harms are mitigated.
When we're talking about the role of technology impact assessment for peace and stability in different contexts, local, national, international, what might that role be for TIA? How can TIA possibly ensure a context of peace and stability?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think the answer is one that's really based in geopolitics. And a good example of that is what's going on with the Trump administration in the US at the moment, and the circus that the president started in February of this year when he revoked the AI safety guardrails that President Biden in the previous administration had articulated. And
Mhm.
those guardrails were put in place to mitigate against technology risks and other risks. What we've seen since then is essentially the bullying coming from the White House with regards to sovereign nations being threatened with penalties or tariffs for putting obstacles in the way of uptake of US-based technology, which is simply to secure their hegemony. And we find that, very disconcerting, as would most, democratic nations, of course, and most fair-minded people. So it would be extremely useful to ensure that a tool of that nature is used by government, our government at least, to undertake the assessment of the technologies being considered, the environments that might be impacted, um, the perspectives that might be considered, and the values that might be impinged or rights that might be impinged.
I'm not surprised that Electronic Frontiers Australia has been in existence for 31 years, given the onset and introduction of widespread technology that impacts all of us. And we've seen the government come up with a list of a top 10 critical and emerging technologies list, but you have seen waves of technologies being deployed in your work and also in your role as a third sector volunteer. My question has to do with, are there patterns that you're seeing in the establishment of emerging tech? Can we still call tech emerging tech even if it's been around for 30 years? And you mentioned, I think, space just a second ago, or space tech a second ago. To you, what are those critical and emerging technologies that we should be looking at, apart from maybe AI?
Yeah. Um, Probably reflecting back just personally, what I'm seeing at the moment, it's my personal view, not EFA's necessarily, is we're still stuck in a tech hype bubble that seems to be replicating what happened at the turn of the century, 1999, 200, with the dot-com boom, which soon became dot-gone boom, where millions and millions of dollars were lost. Um, we're seeing um, a disproportionate amount of political influence, private sector capital, um, pushing various platforms extremely hard, flush with cash, not really showing any financial returns at the moment for a technology that may not actually be the technology we want or need. So large language models cost a lot of money to build. They take huge amounts of data to train, and often data involves infringing upon the rights of others in the forms of copyrighted materials and hoovering up personal data. So that's a major concern, along with the potential environmental impacts that may be that may occur in relation to having data centers to power large language models and big AI systems, plus the impact on the environment in regards to cooling data centers. So for Australia, we're getting very interested in sovereign AI and talking about establishing a range of data centers. Great, but we're the driest continent on the planet. Water is scarce and getting scarcer, it seems, with the growing population as well. And what I've observed, um, occurrences in other countries, such as Ireland or the US in particular, that where these data centers have set up shop, they've usually done a deal with the local state government. They're getting great deals on energy, which has resulted in local communities paying more for power costs. Some communities have had their water supply, significantly compromised, and some communities have had even their property values go down because of the proximity of a data center, but also the um, ecological and environmental impacts of that. And when you consider things like Google coming forward with reports about how much water they consumed to power their data centers, and when you read about it in reputable publications, that it appears that they may have um, you know altered some of the figures to make it more acceptable. You do get really, really strong concerns.
On this path of thinking, if I was to say to you, John, top 10 technologies that as Australians we should consider as critical or emerging tech that will affect us within Australia's borders, what comes to mind? What kinds of technologies?
Thinking AI is clearly um, number one right now, and it's various use cases. So you could probably attach a
Hmm.
lot of weight predominantly to that. And in addition to any potential ecological or environmental impacts, there needs to be better scrutiny around the use cases and claims associated with the use cases, both in terms of benefits to society, and they're typically framed in the context of the three Ps for government, profit, productivity, and prosperity. Um, and it's sort of, has turned recently in Australia at least to our treasurer getting hooked on a phrase, abundance for all. It's just, fairy tale nonsense. It's simply replicating the principles of trickle down economics. And we know how well that works, right?
Hmm.
Um, so AI is very, very critical. But again, the other impacts include um, impacts on labor force, for example. Um, at the moment, I think Waymo is looking at setting up shop in Australia, and Uber are looking at using driverless cars, which makes the gig economy for at least Uber drivers, which was a new thing several years ago, vanish almost instantaneously. Drivers are replaced. Um, Medical tech is really important to us. Um, we're a medium-sized economy, and a lot of our economic benefits come from exporting stuff we dig out of the ground and sell. We're no longer really a manufacturing nation. That door closed a long time ago.
Mm.
Um, we do have some good, innovation labs around the country, and I think most Australians aren't aware of that, what we do in science and tech. And I'm probably not the best advocate for that either. Um, it's I'm not expert in an area, so it's very difficult to say.
Yeah, we were looking as a class not too long ago. I asked a few MBA classes to look up what percent of our GDP was manufacturing based. Very, very low numbers, no double digits, closer to
Yeah.
3 and 4%, if five, but lower than that. We also looked at things like our innovation, deployment and diffusion abroad, and we saw ourselves listed below Botswana as a nation state, somewhere I think it was 135th, if I'm not mistaken. John, when we talk about technology impact assessment and stakeholders, you've mentioned quite a few today. For example, regulators, citizens, third sector organizations. Who do you think the stakeholders of a technology impact assessment are and who should be included?
I think that's sort of various levels of um, abstraction and goes to, stakeholder theory, thinking about users of information systems or usees, for example, as Roger Clark, I think, framed it.
Mm, yes.
I think you have to look at, obviously, we have the individual as a person, the natural person, a group such as it could be, uh, you know, people over 55 and above, or, from 45 to 55, any sort of demographic group you want to carve up, and a category or segment. But it certainly needs to capture, um, for example, vulnerable groups that are often overlooked in assessments of this nature. And that could be, for example, your First Nations cohort, your LGBTIQ plus cohort,
Hmm.
youth cohort. So it's very, very important. Um, we have community, we have society, economic, political stakeholders, and also environment, whether it be or an ecological cohort, and last, your business cohort.
Do you see these stakeholders as being part of the process of technology impact assessment from whom you have to gather primary evidence? And if so, how do you go about doing that?
Well, yeah, obviously having a process and a tool to support that mechanism. Um, so obviously the developer of the technology is going to make a series of claims, and sometimes these claims are quite extraordinary, and governments tend to fall for them, hook, line, and sinker, time and time again. But from my perspective, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence to support that. So I think that clearly there should be a much more evidence gathering from manufacturers of tech in relation to the presumed or claimed benefits the tech will bring. Because at the moment, we know that what we hear is hype. We hear hype all the time, um, and technology that is not matching what the hype is saying.
Do you believe organizations in the future will be held accountable regarding their design processes to the point that they'll have to offer up maybe public risk registers with regards to features and functions of their technologies and their services and apps? Or do you think,
That would be a good step in the sense that it is an adoption of transparency,
Mhm.
which can facilitate accountability. Obviously, there would need to be some third-party government oversight of that to test the authenticity of the claims.
Mhm.
Um, that would be something that would result in the building of basis of trust in a relationship. So, um, for an organization to be trustworthy, it needs to accomplish three things: mastery at what it's doing, integrity in how it does things, and benevolence to its customers. And they're the three fundamental pillars of trust. If they can demonstrate all those three through the use of appropriate tooling, um, that would certainly make for better outcomes all round at the civil society level, at the governmental level, and also for business.
Do you think a process of technology impact assessment, John, uh, where does it sit in a technology's life cycle?
Yeah, pretty good question. I imagine there need to be a series of assessments done from conceptual proof of concept, beta, and pre-market. Um, so I can imagine that there would need to be a series of cascading checks. So there might be a gating process that you put in place.
With respect to the rubric itself or the instrument called Technology Impact Assessment, what are the main elements within a TIA? You've alluded to some already, but in your eyes, what should we be addressing within a TIA?
Um, Definitely the type of technology that is being considered, its history, its
Mhm.
efficacy, its reliability, its trustworthiness, the environments in which deployment will have an impact, and what those impacts are, both positive and negative. What sort of perspectives were reflected upon in terms of um, the drivers of the technology and any inhibiting factors such as um, existing legal frameworks and how it sits within the legal framework, and any potential values that might be impinged upon, which could go to freedom of expression, right to privacy, right to anonymity, and other things like that.
John, when I say the term conducting TIA jointly, and let's look at it from various perspectives, like technology impact assessment done between joint third sector organizations, or TIA done uh, between one nation and another. What does that look like to you? What form might that take?
I think looking at it on a sort of international basis, it adds a degree of complexity
Yes.
because each sovereign state has its own legal framework, uh, values, and ethics which are unique to it. So it's a matter of finding, what is the common ground, um, which would lead to success, and trying to find any areas of misalignment which may impact upon the ability to undertake the assessment and developing a solution for that misalignment, finding common ground.
Do you see, John, any limitations or shortcomings of technology impact assessments?
Not at this stage. The only shortcoming is that they're not widely developed or used. We would love to see an uptake in the use of TIAs by governments in Australia, particularly, as we're going to be affected by the tech that they embrace, or welcoming to Australia through um, economic deals and enhancements. So definitely in Australia.
My last formal question, John, is if TIA could have another name, what might that be? Or do you think it's quite correct to talk about technology impact assessment as an instrument?
I think it's 100% correct, absolutely correct, because there's a myth that technology is neutral. It's not. Technology can have inbuilt biases and unfavorable outcomes for certain groups. Um, Also, um, this idea, oh, sorry, losing my voice,
Ah,
this ideal of technological solutionism, which is the talking points from big tech, and that everything, any problem can be solved with technology. In fact, it doesn't need to be. Do I need, for example, a fridge that has a screen that I can order milk at Woolworths and have it delivered? Not really. But if you put it there, people will use it because of our consumption culture. And that's something for us to ponder over, but we won't change. But I do think calling it a technology impact assessment is um, entirely appropriate.
it's been a really enlightening conversation with you and very sober. I've really enjoyed it, John. You've hit at some things that we have not addressed in previous interviews. My last question, as always, is there anything else you want to add that we didn't get an opportunity to talk about and that you'd like to share?
Um, no, I think I've said that all that I'd like to say, Katina. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate your time and your contribution in this space to the Australian public and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katina.